Yeah, just want to keep this brief. It's just like a question to Alison. It's got me thinking about you being a social reproduction and moving more towards the family and away from the state. This has been we're looking at this kind of, I think there's too much we kind of talk about this kind of ahistorical form of the nuclear family being this kind of dominant form of social reproduction, as if it's fixed throughout time. I think it's kind of like a hunch and a bit of a question, that my feeling that moving towards like different forms or a previous form of family organisation, where you see more the kind of like the role of an extended family or refigured nuclear family, taking care of like young and elderly in previous generations, like bringing people together under one roof in place of the state. And is this like a trend that we're seeing?
Obviously I'm not such a lunatic as to speak for socialist feminism or feminist socialism, but the two points I wanted to make do respond to that to some extent. I think it's worth, first of all, in terms of the question of intersectionality, as has been pointed out, but I want to underline, it's not merely a question of saying, as Marxists we think class is central, but then there's also a multitude of oppressions which overlay on top of that, that's therefore intersectionality. That is not what's going on with theoretically sophisticated intersectionality, because what's fundamental is class relations, not class. This doesn't mean anything. So if we're simply saying, well, you know, it's about the exploitation of labour, that's uncontroversial. When it is pointed out that there's a huge wave, for example, of working class people, mostly women of colour, working directly for mostly white families, that changes our understanding of class relations. And that is why being a feminist, as part of being a Marxist, is not just a kind of optional add-on. It's a question of understanding the changing nature of class relations to be a better Marxist. Second point is much more parochial and is to do with the intersection of gender and the micropolitics of the SWP, which is to say that the things that have gone on in the last 6 months, in one way were incredibly surprising, and in another way were not surprising at all. For the last 5 years at least, many of us within the organisation, as I was at the time and now no longer, I'm in the ISM, many of us knew perfectly well a crisis was coming, and that it was a crisis of democracy and accountability. What we didn't, I think, certainly I didn't predict, was that this would be the wedge issue that would push that forward. But this is about a very important intersection of gender politics and democracy and accountability. This is a crisis of personal and democratic politics as well as a crisis of gender, because we have to ask ourselves, would, for example, if the controversial acts under question were not to do with rape allegations and sexual harassment, would the anti-democratic clampdown been as horrendous, as smearing, as disgraceful, as utterly despicable as they were? It would have been bad, because that was the entrenched culture. Would it have been as bad as this? I think that's a very important thing to remember. So for those of us who either are or are not still within the SWP, and to reiterate, we are all comrades, for those of us who are or who aren't, we need to stress that this is, if you like, interpenetratively, both a crisis of politics around women's oppression and a crisis of democracy, accountability, and the sclerotic form of an inherited party.